It does appear that Games Workshop might have messed up a bit on their changes to 40K's combat rules the other day. Let's take a second look and why they might have broken just as much as they fixed. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where yesterday we did a brief overview of Games Workshop's FAQs and updates to the 40K core rules, including that update that they did to charging people in ruins with a 2-inch engagement range, mainly aimed to prevent people setting up their models in gamey ways to stop people getting an engagement range even if they were very close to the models in these. I thought it was worth revisiting as I hadn't really clocked on to a few other issues that it might cause. In particular, I found one Reddit thread on the competitive 40k page to be particularly interesting about it. I'll link that down in the video description. In brief though, the change is that models within obscuring area terrain will now have a 2-inch engagement range rather than a 1-inch one. This makes units within ruins just that little bit easier to engage, as previously you could have weird situations such as this one on the top right, where the unit in the ruins deploys just over 1 inch away from the ruin walls. Then whatever's outside the ruin can't charge them very easily, because if they're outside the ruin then they're going to be out of engagement range, and there isn't actually enough space for them to put their base inside engagement range due to the models not having left enough room. It means that charges have to be a lot longer as they have to go round to the end of the ruin or the end of the unit, and it can sometimes make a long charge into one that's almost undoable. By making the engagement range 2 inches, it means that say this Chaos Terminator would just be able to charge straight into the Space Marine Scouts, and if they did back off 2 inches away from the walls, there would be enough room to fit his base within the ruin. In terms of fixing this problem, it does so quite nicely. Maybe it still causes issues for models with extremely large bases, but for the most part it's a lot easier to engage than before. Unfortunately though, it does create issues, perhaps 3 major areas of weirdness, and it does sort of feel like Games Workshop's addressed one problem and created themselves 3 more by the way that they've implemented the fix. First up, the one that I had realised in yesterday's video was the deep strike issues, in that now units that are defending ruins just got that little bit easier to charge out of reserve again. It's a bit strange having units just being able to charge them a bit easier in any case, but it makes a really big difference out of deep strike, where you're almost guaranteed to have a fairly hard charge become a much easier one. For example, in this situation we've got 5 orc freebooters hanging out in this ruin. For some reason Games Workshop made their clan trait a lot worse, but in this situation they're going to be a bit easier to charge as well. Now they're just sitting in the ruin, not doing the gamey 1 inch away from walls thing, as it doesn't really gain them much, but it does mean that say these Space Marine Assault Marines coming in from reserve are going to find it easier to charge them. Typically when you come in from reserve you have to set up 9 inches away, so normally a 9-inch charge, which would be only a 27% chance. By having engagement range be all the way out to 2 inches rather than 1 though, it now means you're getting an 8-inch charge rather than a 9-inch one. For most units that's going to be a big boost for a 27% charge go up to a 42%, and if you budgeted a command point reroll in both circumstances, it now goes from a 48% to a 66%. It does mean that if your opponent's bringing in reserves, then anything in ruins is a potential area of weakness, and a potential way of slingshotting units into combat just a little bit easier. It gets even more reliable for them if you say had a +1 to charge already, say Blood Angel Space Marines for example. An 8-inch one would essentially become a 7-inch charge, 42% chance going to 58% under normal circumstances, and with a command point reroll budgeted, that 66 increases up to an 83%. Very reliable, and means that with a +1 to charge army, you're now getting a unit in 5 out of 6 times if you do have that CP budgeted. Perhaps the weirdest thing about all of this is that the enemy unit doesn't even need to be in the ruins to be able to take advantage of this, they just need to be next to them. If the enemy unit's anywhere within 2 inches of the edge of the terrain piece, you still might be able to use this. Just have, say, the Assault Marines finish their charge only just within the confines of the area terrain. You're still drawing the engagement range line through the terrain piece, so you've got an easier charge on the orcs even if they weren't in the ruin in the first place. It does feel like a weird and non-intentional buff to people charging from reserve. Next up, another interesting quirk is that the 2-inch engagement range doesn't appear to be confined to the charge phase or anything like that, so it's also quite good for move blocking. It means that if you'd set up a squad in the midfield, say some infiltrators or something in some midfield ruins, then they now have a big 2-inch exclusion zone where the enemy can't go within that range in the movement phase, and that could be kind of annoying for other enemy units trying to pass them even if they weren't trying to charge them. It'd be particularly problematic for things with very big bases, maybe stuff like greater demons or enemy vehicles, and things get even weirder if you've got a squad half in and half out of ruins. You'd strangely have an engagement range that's 2 inch on part of the squad but 1 inch on the other, depending on where the closest line is drawn from. An extra inch of move block isn't really the biggest deal in the world, I don't think, but again it does feel a bit arbitrary and not entirely intentional. If you've got a squad that just wants to hold back the enemy, then having any of the models within obscuring area terrain is a really big bonus. If it ever makes the difference between a big model being able to pass between two bits of terrain and not being able to, then the impact could be quite big. Finally, perhaps the stupidest and slightly game-breaking thing that theoretically can happen are Gamey Combats, where the charging model happens to be able to hit the enemy, but then won't be able to hit back if they do some movement shenanigans. The issue is that variable engagement range. If it's sometimes 2 inches, but in other cases 1 inch, then if the opponent can position themselves so they're within 2 inches for them, and their consolidate makes it a 1 inch, then they can potentially escape combat without being hit back. Just for an example, say the Space Marine captain is charging these Chaos Terminators that are just next to area terrain. He makes a successful charge and comes within the 2-inch engagement range. He makes his attacks, maybe kills a Terminator or two, and then uses his Consolidate move just to jump outside of cover. He has got slightly closer to the closest model. He has closed the gap from 1.9 inches to 1.5. But it also moved in such a way that now the closest engagement range won't be drawn through the area terrain piece, so now the rule no longer applies and you're back to a 1-inch engagement range. This means that now the Terminators are out of engagement range, and as per the core rules, they're actually not allowed to activate and fight. For some reason in 9th edition, the rules for activating in the charge phase are either if you happen to make a charge move or you're within engagement range of the enemy. Being charged doesn't actually automatically guarantee that you're able to fight. It's really not that hard to achieve for any unit that's basically towing the edge of area terrain, but for some units it's going to be a bigger deal than others. It's a fair bit easier to swing with maximal effect if you are charging with very small units or just single models like this. You're going to struggle to make the movement shenanigans work as well with bigger units. This one's definitely another gamey edge case scenario. I'm sure it won't be the biggest issue in the vast majority of games of 40k, but whenever the positioning does work out for someone and they decide that they're going to try and exploit it, it is pretty powerful being able to hit the opponent but not have them hit back until next turn. When the original fix was aimed at preventing a slightly gamey combat phase positioning shenanigan, it does seem a pretty bad fail when you've just created another one in the effort to fix it. So speaking of fixes then, what are the main options that Games Workshop has for trying to make this rule work a bit better? Of course you could just scrap the change altogether and go back to the way that they were. The strange positioning in Ruins thing did always feel a bit off to me, but the way that things are at the moment, I do feel that it's created just as much weirdness as it fixes, if not more. Otherwise, I think they basically have 3 different options. They could either change the charge or fight phase rules fundamentally, specifically patch out these 3 different issues, or change the new rule in some way. Changing the charge or fight phase rules does feel like a bit overkill if it's just in reaction to a rule that addressed an edge case scenario. But I don't think most people would be against the rule that if your unit was charged they still get to activate even if they aren't in engagement range anymore. That would at least fix the last scenario and prevent a few other gamey consolidation type rules in 40k outside that. Otherwise, you could specifically patch these 3 issues if Games Workshop feels that they're important enough to be fixed. For the Deep Strike one, they could have a -1 to the charge penalty if they're going to apply this rule when doing so. I'm not sure if that's the best solution, but I guess it would at least keep the chances of charges the same. You could perhaps specifically say that if enemies use this rule to attack opponents at greater than 1 inch away, then they will always be able to make use of it when they swing back. And for move blocking things, you could potentially say that the engagement range change only applies to the charge or fight phase, that might lead to the weird situation of units being engaged in combat and then able to act normally in the movement phase. Patching them all individually though does seem like a bit of bloat for just one change. Finally, and I guess probably the best solution, is to try and change the new rule in some way, though I'm a little unsure as to how best to implement it. I guess maybe a good start would be that it only applies actually passing through ruin walls, as opposed to just any bit of the area terrain. That would at least limit the weirdness to units that are right next to the ruin walls, as opposed to units that are just near the area in general. Or you could potentially make ruin walls use the defense line trait, one that already works at least fairly well for barricades, though I do think they're a little bit clunky. So anyway, let me know what you think of the changes then, whether they need fixing and how you would do so. Look forward to hearing your feedback down in the comments. I do feel that most of these aren't going to have absolutely enormous impacts on the vast majority of 40k games, but it does feel like a bit of a step back, trying to fix one problem and creating multiple others when you do so. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k things coming, with new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.